Hello and welcome to The Wargamer, and you're joining me for another Games Workshop painting tutorial. This time I'll be showing you how to paint the iconic Greater Demon of Tzeentch, which is of course Kairos Fateweaver, and I'll be using the Citadel range of paints to do so. So here we have the Kairos Fateweaver I'll be painting in this video. Now, at least most of them anyway, because I've kept a few of the components separate, most notably the loincloth is a separate piece. The two heads have been kept separate along with their neck as well, and finally the staff is also a separate item too. Now once you've assembled, or at least part assembled, you'll want to prime your miniature. Now I've used a grey spray primer for this because generally speaking it's better to paint over a lighter base coat, especially on a miniature like this which has lots of bright colours that we want to paint over. So once you've primed the miniature, the first task is going to be painting the dark blue areas of skin. Now generally speaking it's better to paint the darker areas first and then work your way to the lighter colours afterwards, because if you overspill onto a dark area with a light colour, it's a lot easier to overpaint than it is to do the other way around. Now first of all we'll be starting off with a base coat of Kantor Blue, followed by a wash of Drakenhof Nightshade across all of these blue areas. Then we'll start with two highlights. First of all we'll be using Teclis Blue, followed by a final highlight of Lothern Blue. So the first task is to apply the Kantor Blue across the dark blue areas of the miniature. Now I'd recommend just taking a look at some of the pre-painted miniatures just to see exactly which areas you want. But generally speaking it's going to be the outer areas of the arms and also the top areas of the wings here. Now you can see as I'm applying it on here, it's actually not being applied very thickly. Now this is because I've mixed in some water, roughly 1 part water to 2 parts Kantor Blue should provide enough thinning for this process. And this will really help us in applying quickly over the surface without obscuring the details. So once this layer is dry, I'll be applying a second layer over the top. Now this is quite a lot of areas to paint on this miniature, so if you do have access to an airbrush, I'd probably strongly recommend using this as the base layer. If not, you could just use a large brush and do it by hand. It would give you a little bit more control and stop any overspillage, however, if you did it by hand. But either way is fine, as long as you get a nice and even coverage of Kantor Blue. Once we have a solid Kantor Blue base coat across the miniature, we now want to apply a wash of Drakenhof Nightshade. Now I'm going to be applying this across the entirety of the blue areas that we painted in the previous step, and this will pull into the recesses, really bring out some of those details that we've got there, and also darken the blue slightly as well. Now I've mixed in roughly 1 part water to 1 part Drakenhof Nightshade for this mixture, and what we're doing is we'll be applying a second coat over the top once it's completed. It just means that the wash itself won't be applied on too strongly. Now this, as an entirely optional step, if you wish to, you could actually apply some Nuln Oil targeted washes into the recesses as well, and this will just enhance the details also. With the Drakenhof Nightshade wash completed, you can see the surface is a lot darker and a lot of the details have been brought out as well. Now we want to further enhance those details by using our Teclis Blue. Now I'm going to be using this to pick out some of the ridges you can see in the skin itself, and these are scattered across the entirety of the skin that we've painted in the previous steps. We want to use this just to drag the brush very lightly across the surface and just pick out some of these details and folds in the skin. Now mixing in just a small amount of water here will really assist you in applying these steps, and also make the actual highlights a little bit more subtle and a little bit more realistic as well. I'm going to do this across the entirety of the miniature, wherever we've painted the blue. Now following the application of the Teclis Blue, we now want to apply the Lothern Blue to the tips of the areas that we've already painted before, especially on these spines that we've got here. So I'm just very carefully picking out the tips here with the Lothern Blue. And we're doing this across the entirety of the miniature. Wherever we've painted a highlight of Teclis Blue, we want to just add a small amount of Lothern Blue just to the edges. With the blue areas of the miniature completed, the next step is start painting the pink areas. This includes the feathers on the wing and also the tabard as well. Now we're starting off with a base coat of Screamer Pink, followed by a wash of Druchii Violet before beginning our highlights. First of all with Pink Horror, and then finally Cadian Fleshtone. As we did with the Kantor Blue on the blue feathers, we want to apply the Pink Horror across the miniature with some water mixed in. I've roughly got a mixture of 1 part water to 2 parts Screamer Pink. You can thin this down a little bit more if you wish to, but it's just personal preference really. And basically once this first layer has been completed and dried, we'll then be applying a second layer of the same mix over the surface. And using a larger brush will also help with the application of this, but if you do have access to an airbrush, you could also use that to apply the base layer instead. So pay particular attention not to overspill when you actually start painting around the blue areas that you've already painted. You maybe use a smaller brush and just take your time when you get a little bit closer. Now once you've finished applying the base coat of Scream Pink, you should have a nice and even surface like this that we can build up from. Now the next step is to apply a Druchii Violet wash over the feathers, and this will really bring out the feathers. But instead of washing over the entire surface, we'll instead just be focusing into the recesses. Now mixing in just a small amount of water with this Druchii Violet, roughly about a 1-to-1 mix of Druchii Violet and water, will reduce the strength of the wash. It won't be quite as strong, and also means you have a little bit more control in flowing it into the recesses. So once you've applied it roughly into a recess, you can then just drag your thumb or a piece of cloth over the surface very lightly. It will remove the excess from the surface but retain the actual wash in the recesses, and we're doing this across the entirety of the surface. So as you can see, the Druchii Violet wash has pooled into the recesses, creating a layer of and really helped to bring out some of the feathers as well, without darkening them too much. Now the next step is to apply some highlights to the feathers. Now this time we're going to be using our pink horror, and we're going to be using a small brush for this. And what we want to do is want to very carefully pick out some of the edges of the feathers with just a small line. So what I've done here, I've mixed in some water with the Screamer Pink, roughly 2 parts Screamer Pink to 1 part water, just to make the flow of the paint a little bit easier to control. And very lightly drag your brush along the edges. Now you can dry brush if you want to, but I prefer to use a normal brush technique for this step, because dry brushing can often give you quite a dusty finish if it's not done properly. So if you want to spend a little bit more time, then you can do it this way, but if you're in a hurry, you could feel free to dry brush instead. With the pink horror highlight completed, you can see I've got all the feathers picked out individually here. Now I've gone for the standard actual picking out using a brush rather than a dry brush, but the next technique. Now once you finish picking out the feathers with the pink horror, the next step is to bring in our Cadian Fleshtone. And this time we just want to focus more around the actual tips of the feathers themselves, rather than painting the whole edges. So just a very tip there, just applying a small amount of Cadian Fleshtone just to the tip like so. A little bit on each of these feathers, and also some of these sections where you can see that feathers have been ruffled up, you can also apply a little bit more Cadian Fleshtone to those areas as well. With the pink feathers completed, the next step is to start painting the lighter gradients towards the tips of these bottom feathers. Now first of all, we'll be applying a glaze of Emperor's Children, before applying a second glaze of Ushabti Bone, and then finally a highlight of White Scar. Now for this step, you'll need to create a mixture of Lamian Medium and Emperor's Children. Now I've mixed in roughly a 1-to-1 mixture, so 1 part Emperor's Children to 1 part Lamian Medium. And what we'll do is we'll then apply this over the surface, and we'll build it up in layers. So the first layer looks quite thick as I'm applying it, however this will dry and it'll become a lot more blended in with the bottom colour. And what I'm doing is I'm feathering it out towards the middle of the feather itself. And this will create a nice gradient between the darker pink and the lighter pink as we get closer towards the tips. Now once this layer has dried, I'll be applying a second layer, but this time starting a little bit further in until we get a very strong colour of Emperor's Children at the tip here, and just a very mild gradient towards the middle of the feather. So as you can see, the Emperor's Children has created a nice blend from the stronger colour down towards the darker Screamer Pink. The next step is to perform the exact same technique using Ushabti Bone this time. Again, I've mixed in a 1-to-1 quantity of Ushabti Bone and Lamian Medium. I'll be focusing mainly towards the tips here, but then feathering it out towards roughly the bottom of the feather. We only want the very tips here to be as light as the Ushabti Bone will make the feather. Now if you are struggling with this technique, you could also apply a dry brushing technique instead of this, or if you don't have access to Lamian Medium, instead just apply some of this onto a dry brush and then build this up over a few layers. A few light layers of dry brushing should give you a similar effect, although the transitions probably won't be quite as smooth. With the Ushabti Bone tip completed, the next step is to use some White Scar to finish off the highlights. And this time, we're not using any Lamian Medium, just a little bit of water will be all we need for this. And this time we're just going to be highlighting the very tip of the feather. And as you can see here, I'm actually painting the top side of the tip. We don't want to paint the whole of it here. Basically, we just want to create a nice finishing off to the actual tip of the feather. And you could also use the same White Scar just to highlight the spine that runs down the center of the feather as well if you wanted to, but only do this if you've got a steady hand and a fine brush. The next areas of the miniature we'll be painting will be the lighter blue sections that we've got on the chest here, and also on the inner legs and the neck as well. Now we'll be starting off with a base coat of Celestra Grey, followed by a glaze of Guilliman Blue, before applying a layer of Fenrisian Grey, and then finally a highlight of Blue Horror. So the first task is to apply the Celestra Grey to the lighter grey areas of the body that we didn't paint when we painted the dark blue areas. So I've mixed in some water with this step, and this will just aid us in applying this, both in the flow of the paint, but also getting a really nice and even base layer. So I'll be applying this first layer, and then a second layer over the top once it's dried. Now when you actually come to paint some of these areas where we start blending into the darker blue, you could always just feather it out using a dry brush, or you could mix in a small amount of Lamium medium and just blend them very subtly into the darker blue. With the base coat of Celestra Grey completed, the next step is to apply a glaze of Guilliman Blue. Now I've mixed in some Lamium medium with this step because I don't want to be applying it too strongly out of the part, and what this will do is it will actually slightly pull into the recesses, but also give the skin a slightly bluish tinge, as you can see I'm doing here. And this first base will just be quite a light wash, but you can always apply more layers over the top. I'd recommend maybe about 2 layers should suffice, and then you need to just allow it to thoroughly dry between each application of the wash. Following the glaze of Guilliman Blue, the next step is to apply a layer of Fenrisian Blue, and this time we'll just be focusing on the raised sections of the torso. We're going to leave the darker blue visible in the recesses. Now Fenrisian Blue is ever so slightly lighter than the glaze effect we've got from the previous step, so this will just create some nice contrast between the higher raised sections and the deeper sections, and really bring out the detail on here. Again, if you just mix in a small amount of water for this step, it should really assist you in applying and also controlling the paint. Once we've finished with the Fenrisian Blue, we now want to apply a very fine highlight of Blue Horror across the raised sections of skin, such as this here, and also the spines on the chest there as well, just picking them out individually. Pretty much any area where we've got a pronounced section of skin, you can just apply a small line of Blue Horror just to enhance these areas. Once you've finished painting the pale areas, the next step is to start painting the turquoise blue areas of the miniatures. This includes the hands and the wrists, also the feathers that we've got on the back of the legs here, the top sections of the wings, and also some of the dangling scriptures that we can find on the tome on the staff and also on the beak as well. Now we're starting off painting all of these areas, first of all with a base coat of Thousand Suns Blue, followed by a layer of Temple Guard Blue, before finally highlighting with Baharroth Blue. Now Thousand Suns Blue is a base layer, which should mean it will cover really nicely over the grey areas of the miniature, but if you just include a small amount of water in with the mixture, it will improve the flow slightly and allow you to get the best coverage possible. Now when painting the actual hands, it's fairly straightforward. You just paint a solid amount of colour, but when you actually want to start blending into the rest of the arms, you could just mix in a little bit more water and just build it up over a few small layers, or you could mix in some Lamium medium and use a similar technique that we adopted for the Screamer Pink and Ushabti Bone sections of the wing. With the base coat of Thousand Suns Blue completed, the next step is to apply our layer of Temple Guard Blue. This time we're going to be picking out some of these details with the Temple Guard Blue. We're going to leave the darker Thousand Suns Blue visible in the recesses still, because this will really help to bring out and emphasize these details. So I've mixed in just a small amount of water here, just roughly a 1 part water to 2 parts Temple Guard Blue should be enough to just improve the flow of the paint off the brush. The final step in painting the hand is to just apply a very small amount of Baharroth Blue on the very tips of these raised sections, especially around the claws and the feathers. You can just really easily pick just the tips out, and this really enhance the detail and gives this nice bluing magical glow. With the blue areas of the miniature completed, the next step is to start painting the feet. Now we're starting off with a base coat of XV88, followed by a wash of Seraphim Sepia, before beginning our highlights, first of all with Light Ochre, and then finally Ungor Flesh. As with our other base coats, I would recommend mixing in a small amount of water in with the XV88, and this will just improve the flow slightly. And also mixing in some water will allow you to feather the transition between the XV88 on the feet and the blue on the legs. Now we'll also be painting some of the other areas of the miniature using this, and notably the beak areas, but if there's any other similar yellow areas that you wish to paint, you could also use the exact same techniques that I'm using here. With the base coat completed, the next step is to wash over the feet using Seraphim Sepia, and mixing in just a small amount of water here will give you better coverage overall, and allow you to apply a couple of coats, which will just give you some really nice shading in the recesses of these feet. And there's quite a lot of small folds and creases, so this will really enhance the effect that we're going for here. So make sure you get it across the entirety of the XV88, and make sure you've got quite a nice and even coverage. With the Seraphim Sepia wash dry, you can see we've got a lot more detail has been brought out in the skin. Now we want to enhance that by applying some highlights of Light Ochre. So I've got a small amount on my brush here. I'm just going to be very carefully just picking out some of these raised sections just along the edges. Just using a small brush with just a small amount of paint on the tip. And I've watered it down ever so slightly as well. Roughly 1 part water to 2 parts Light Ochre. And this will just give you optimum control over the paint and the brush as you apply it across these edges. The final step in painting the feet and the beaks is to use some Ungor Flesh just to pick out some of the very tips here. So I'm going to be focusing mainly on some of the edges that are towards the top here. So you can see here we've got quite a strong point here. So I'm going to be using the Ungor Flesh on there, just a small amount on my brush. And also along this ridge here, you can see it's on the top of the miniature, so that's where the light is going to be hitting. Just a small amount just along there. And pretty much anywhere where we have a strong corner or a strong edge, I'll be applying the Ungor Flesh, like so. The next step in painting Kairos Fateweaver is to paint the staff and also the other areas where we have flames, such as the icon topper at the top. Now we're going to be painting this in a couple of different stages, mainly because we have some quite complex gradients travelling the length of the staff. Now we'll be starting off with a base coat of Ceramite White, followed by Averland Sunset, then we'll be using Ratskin Flesh, and then finally Abaddon Black. The first base coat we'll be applying will be Ceramite White. Now we want to apply this in 3 locations: the bottom of the staff, the centre of the staff, and at the very top of the staff as well. Now we're painting with Ceramite White first, because generally speaking it's easier to paint light colours first and then use dark colours to paint over the top of them. So using my Ceramite White, I've mixed in some water here. I'm just going to be applying this around the bottom of the staff here. Now it should cover really nicely as it's a base paint, but it'll also cover quite easily over the grey primer that we've got here. No need to worry about being too neat at this stage, because we will be neatening things up later on. We just want to apply a nice and even coverage over the bottom sections and the middle section, and also the top as well. Now for this step you'll need to mix in a small amount of Lamy medium, and this will act as the gradient between the 2 colours, the yellow and the white, that we applied previously. And you want to apply the mixture over the top of the Ceramite White we applied in the previous step, and this will feather in. And if we just apply roughly a mixture of about 1:1 Lamy medium, although you may wish to apply a little bit more just to get a really nice gradient. Then once you've got a gradient, you can actually just apply some Averland Sunset. It's only been thinned down just for the rest of the section. I want to carry on roughly to this height up the staff. With the Averland Sunset layer completed, the next step is to start applying some Ratskin Flesh. Now, this has been mixed with some Lamy medium. We'll be applying this in much the same way as the previous step. And I'm going to be transitioning this into the yellow, first of all. And then once we've done that, we can actually start applying some more block colour. So you can just apply some Ratskin Flesh, just mixed with some water for these other areas. And we just want to get just prior to where we start seeing this curvature appear. So you can see the curve there, we want to apply it in either side of these areas. Now, following the application of the Ratskin Flesh, we now want to finish the base coats off by applying the Abaddon Black. Now, we're going to be painting the areas that we haven't painted yet, which is going to be these grey sections here. But again, we want to mix in just a small amount of Lamy medium, just so we can work on these transitions into the darker sections of the paint. So again, for these main sections, just mix in a small amount of water, but for the transitions, make sure you get a rough mixture of 1:1 of Lamy medium and Abaddon Black. With the base coats applied to the staff, the next step is to highlight these edges that we've got running up the staff there. We want to first of all use Dorn Yellow, followed by a highlight of Lugganoth Orange, before finally highlighting with Doombull Brown. So for this step, you just want to concentrate on these raised sections of the staff, like so. Just mix in a small amount of water in with your Dorn Yellow and use a small brush, and this will allow you to just easily drag the brush along these edges wherever we've got the yellow paint. So as with the previous step, we now want to highlight the orange areas, this time using the Lugganoth Orange, and I'll be using just a very fine brush just to apply a slight layer just along these edges here. And want to blend them in to the highlights we applied in the previous steps as well. And we're going to be working these across the entirety of the staff wherever we've got the orange painted. The next step is to finish off the highlights by applying a small line of Doombull Brown onto these black areas of the miniature that we've got remaining in the center. Again, we just want a small amount on your brush here. I'm just going to be using this to pick out some of the raised sections, these ovals here, and also the edges themselves. Again, mixing in just a small amount of water, roughly 2 pots Doombull Brown to 1 pot water, will give you a really nice flow in which to control the brush. The next step is to paint the talons on Kairos Fateweaver's feet, and we'll first of all be using a base coat of Abaddon Black, followed by a highlight of Eshin Grey, and then a final highlight of Dawnstone. As Abaddon Black is a base paint, you should have no problem covering over the grey primer. Now I've mixed in a small amount of water here, roughly 1 part water to 2 parts Abaddon Black, and that will give you the best control over the paint. And this is especially important when you come to paint the areas of the talons that are close to the skin, as you don't want to overspill. So using the Eshin Grey, you can see I'm just picking out the ridges in the actual talons themselves, and also focusing around the points also. Again, just mixing in a small amount of water for this step will really assist you in getting nice and even coverage over the surface and controlling the paint as best as possible. The final step in painting the black talons is to use the Dawnstone, and this time we're going to be focusing more towards the tips of the talons themselves. This will give us a shiny, sharp effect. You can see here I'm just using a small amount on the tip of my brush here just to pick it out. Also, when you come to paint the talons that are actually on the ground themselves, you could actually drag the brush very carefully along the top ridge of the talon, and this will just give the illusion of light hitting the top of the talon and reflecting off. The next area we'll be painting on this miniature are the hooks and the spikes that are on the wings. Now we'll be starting off with a base coat of Stormvermin Fur, followed by a first highlight of Baneblade Brown, before finally finishing off the highlights with Karak Stone. Now Stormvermin Fur is a greyish brown paint, and it'll give us a really nice base coat for this kind of dirty, dark bone colour that we want to achieve. Now it's not a base paint, so you would probably have to just mix in a small amount of water with this mixture. Usually 1 part Stormvermin Fur to 1 part water should suffice, and then once the first layer has dried, you can apply a second layer over the top, and this will give us a really nice and even base coat coverage in which to build up from. Now following the base coat, the next step is to apply a highlight of Baneblade Brown. Now we'll be focusing this on the raised ridges of the claws. You can see here we've got one going along the edge here. Just a small amount of paint on the brush, and I've mixed in some water with the paint as well. Roughly 1 part water to 2 parts Baneblade Brown. This gives us enough of a thinned down mixture just to allow us to control the brush better, and also act as a slight feathering effect as well when we paint it over the base coat. So we're just going to be focusing this across all of the bony spines, and also on the knee there as well, just picking out the edges and leaving the darker colour visible in the recesses. The next step is to apply the Karak Stone just on the very tips of these bone ridges and talons that emanate from the miniature. Just using a very small amount on the tip of my brush here just to apply a very small dot or line to the sharper sections of these ridges. This will really emphasise the detail and really give us this nice bone effect. The next step is to paint the tome that is atop the Staff of Tomorrow. Now we're painting the pages, first of all with a base coat of Celestra Grey, followed by a layer of Ulthuan Grey, before finally highlighting with White Scar. Then once we've done that, we're applying some markings and writing to the pages using Abaddon Black and Khorne Red. Now Celestra Grey is a base paint, so it should cover really nicely over the grey prime that we've got here. But again, mixing in just a small amount of water, roughly 1 part Celestra Grey to 1 pot water, will give you a really nice and even coverage. And especially if you leave this layer to dry and then apply a second one over the top, you'll get a really nice and crisp, clean base coat. With the base coat completed, we now want to apply a layer of Ulthuan Grey over the top. Now I want to help blend this into some of the shading where we've got around these these bookmarks, these golden pendants that are dangling from the tome itself. So I've mixed in some Lamium Medium, roughly 1 part Lamium Medium to 1 part Ulthuan Grey. I'm going to be using this to just build up a thin layer initially, and especially when it comes to painting towards the inner sections of the book, especially where we've got the dip in the spine. I just want to feather the layer up a bit. But essentially what we want to do is we want to lighten the overall colour of these tomes. We want to get ultimately a almost white appearance to the pages. We just want to make sure we keep the darker sections visible in the recesses when we apply this. We're going to be applying this across the entirety of the pages. Following the Ulthuan Grey application, we now want to apply a small line of white scar just along the edges of the pages. I'm also going to be using this to pick out some of the holes and the kind of the moth-eaten sections of the book. We're just going to be using a small brush with just a small amount of white scar at the tip, just to pick out the edges along the pages. With the pages completed, the next step is to apply some text and imagery to the pages. So first of all, I'll be using some Khorne Red on a thin brush I've mixed in some water with as well, and I'll just be using this to draw a thin line, like so. And then I'll be rounding this off to make a trident, and using a really thin brush will really assist you in performing these steps. As you can see here, just very small amounts of paint is needed in order to get this effect. I'll be applying various symbols across the pages using the same paint. With the red symbols completed, we can now start filling in the blanks with some black ink symbols. So this is going to be the same kind of technique, just a small amount of black ink on the surface here. I'm just going to be drawing in several small runic symbols. Now if you have the Disciples of Tzeentch battle tome, you can actually find a really good reference point for a lot of these symbols here. You can just make them up yourself if you want, just some various geometric shapes with dots and swirls work really well. But if you just want to make something simpler, you could actually just apply some straight wiggly lines in between the gaps where we've got the rest of the symbols. The next step in painting Kairos Fateweaver is to tackle the numerous gold areas across the miniature. Now we'll be starting off with a base coat of Retributor armor, followed by a layer of Liberator Gold. Then we'll be washing over the gold areas with Ratskin Flesh before finishing up with a highlight of Stormhost Silver. Now we'll be starting off with a base coat of Retributor armor. Now this is an excellent base layer in which to build up from. It gives you a really nice bright gold, and it is a base paint as well, which means it'll cover really nicely over the actual grey primer or any blue areas, as you can see here, that I've overspilled onto. Now just be very careful when applying this. Mix in just a small amount of water just to improve the flow of the paint and give it some better control, especially when you're painting areas that are close to the non-metallic areas such as the skin, as it can be quite tricky to repaint over those areas with a non-metallic paint if you've spilt over with a metallic paint. With the first layer of gold completed, we've got a little bit of a brighter colour than what we actually want here. So we're going to be dulling this down slightly with a layer of Liberator Gold. So when we apply this layer, we want to focus mainly on the actual flat areas and leave the original base coat still visible in the recess. As you can see here, I'm just applying it over this knee pad here and just leaving the darker gold still visible in the crevices. And this just really enhances the detail on the miniature. With the Liberator Gold completed, the next step is to wash over the gold areas using the Ratskin Flesh shade. As you can see, this will pull into these recesses here and really bring out some of the detailing, as well as giving the gold a slightly reddish hue. Now we want to focus it ideally into these recesses just to bring out the shading even more so, but mixing in just a small amount of water will reduce the severity of the wash and gives a much more subtle blend. The final step in painting these gold areas is to highlight the edges using the Stormhost Silver. So just get a small amount of the paint on your tip of your brush and just gently drag it across these edges and raise sections across these golden areas. And this will really give them a bright shine. It will act like light is reflecting off the shiny surface. So just use a small amount of paint on the brush, water it down if necessary if you find that the flow is too sticky off the brush, and just gently drag the paint across these edges. The next step is to paint the various eyes and gems that are scattered across the miniature. Now for this we'll be starting off with a base coat of Cabalite Green, followed by a layer of Sybarite Green before finally highlighting with Gauss Plaster Green. The first step in painting these green areas is just apply a small amount of Cabalite Green to cover the entire surface, and this will just act as the base layer. And this will just give us a really nice dark green in which to build up from in later steps. With the base coat applied to the gems, we want to apply a highlight of the Sybarite green now. We want to just apply a small amount so that we've still got the darker green still visible around the edges and the recesses as well. The final step in painting these green areas is just to apply a small dot of Gauss Plaster Green just into the top corners of the eyes. And this will really help these eyes pop and give them a glowing theme. You can start to see I'm doing it on all of these gems here, focusing towards the top of the green. And here we have the completed Kairos Fateweaver, who you can see I've fully based and also assembled. Now, whilst this tutorial focused exclusively on Kairos Fateweaver, you could apply the exact same colours and techniques to the other Laws of Change. Now, if you enjoyed this tutorial, please do let me know in the comments below, along with any suggestions for future tutorials. Do be sure to check out both my Facebook and Instagram pages, which you can find links to in the description as well, and also consider joining the Wargamer community, which is also on Facebook as well. This video was made entirely possible by my Patreon supporters, so I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who supported me on Patreon. If you would like to become one of my patrons and help support these tutorials, you can do so by checking out my Patreon page, which you can find a link to in the description below. So until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.